June 3rd, 1942. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In the underground intelligence rooms of the Pacific Fleet headquarters, the air was damp, close, and heavy with cigarette smoke. Electric fans turned slowly above maps of the Pacific, stirring the smell of paper, sweat, coffee, and salt air that drifted in from the harbor. Outside, the wounds of December 7th still marked the base. Blackened steel, repaired docks, patched hangars, and sailors moving with a new hardness in their faces all reminded every man on Oahu that the Japanese Navy had not simply attacked America. It had humiliated it. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz stood over a chart table, his hands resting near a cluster of colored markers. Each marker represented ships, aircraft, fuel, distance, and risk. But to Nimitz, they also represented lives. The lives of pilots who would soon fly into walls of anti-aircraft fire. The lives of sailors who would be trapped below decks if a bomb found a magazine. The lives of young men aboard American carriers that were still outnumbered, still vulnerable, and still the only sharp blade left in the Pacific. Before him lay Midway, a tiny coral atoll nearly lost in the vast blue emptiness northwest of Hawaii. On paper, it looked insignificant. In reality, it was the next doorway to Pearl Harbor. If Japan seized Midway, its patrol planes could watch the Central Pacific. Its fleet could threaten Hawaii again, and the Americans would be forced even farther back. The Japanese plan was built on that expectation. They believed Nimitz would defend Midway like a fortress, keeping his carriers close to the island, waiting for the hammer to fall. But Nimitz had no intention of waiting under the hammer. Across the room, intelligence officers from Station Hypo had already given him the impossible gift of foresight. Commander Joseph Rochefort's code breakers had worked through sleepless nights, surrounded by message intercepts, Japanese naval call signs, and half-broken fragments of enemy orders. They had identified the Japanese target. They had confirmed that AF meant Midway. Now Nimitz knew that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was coming with a massive fleet, including the carrier striking force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Nagumo's carriers had already become legends of terror across the Pacific. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These ships had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. Their pilots had swept through the Indian Ocean. Their decks had sent waves of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes against enemies who often never saw them coming. Japanese admirals believed the Kido Butai was still the finest carrier force in the world. Nimitz understood that belief. More importantly, he understood its weakness. If the Japanese expected him to defend Midway from nearby waters, then they would search for him in the wrong place. If they believed American carriers would be held back as shields for the island, then they might never imagine that those carriers were already moving into position like hunters. Nimitz's decision was quiet, simple, and shocking. He would not place his carriers directly beside Midway. He would send them northeast of the atoll, beyond the expected Japanese line of approach, into a position where they could ambush Nagumo's carriers at the moment the enemy was focused on bombing the island. It was a decision that carried terrible danger. The American carrier force was fragile. USS Enterprise and USS Hornet were available under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. USS Yorktown, battered at the Coral Sea, had been rushed back into service with repair crews working around the clock. Her flight deck had been patched. Her systems had been made usable, not perfect. Men who had expected her to spend months in a shipyard now watched her steam out again. Scarred but alive, Nimitz knew the numbers. He knew the Japanese had more battleships, more experience, and carrier air groups filled with veterans. He also knew that if he chose a defensive posture, he would surrender the one advantage he possessed: surprise on the map. The American carriers were not placed like a wall. They were placed like a knife. Spruance and Rear, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher would take the carriers out to an area later known as Point Luck. It was not a fortress. It was open ocean. No land batteries. No safe harbor. No guarantee that Japanese reconnaissance would miss them. But if the plan worked, the Americans would appear on Nagumo's flank at the precise moment when the Japanese decks were crowded with aircraft, fuel hoses, bombs, torpedoes, and the confusion of changing orders. Nimitz straightened from the table. Around him, officers waited for final words, though most already understood what had been decided. There would be no passive defense of Midway. There would be no desperate last stand in the shadow of the island. The Pacific Fleet would move first by hiding, then strike by appearing where the Japanese least expected it. Far out at sea, engines were warming. Flight crews checked machine guns, patched fabric, loaded bombs, and studied maps of an ocean where a few degrees of error could mean never finding the enemy at all. On Midway, Marines prepared their guns and aircraft, not knowing exactly how soon the first Japanese bombers would arrive. And somewhere beyond the horizon, Nagumo's carriers were already driving eastward. Confident that the next blow would belong to Japan, Nimitz had made his decision. The trap was being set. June 4th, 1942, northeast of Midway Atoll. Before dawn, the American carriers moved through black water with every light masked and every voice lowered. The ocean seemed too wide to hold so many ships and yet too small to hide them. USS Enterprise cut through the swells with her bow rising and falling in a steady rhythm. USS Hornet followed nearby, her flight deck dark except for the faint glow of shielded lamps. Farther away, USS Yorktown steamed under Fletcher's command, her wounded steel still bearing the memory of Coral Sea. This was Point Luck, the chosen hunting ground. There was no landmark, no harbor, no reef, no visible sign that history had chosen this patch of ocean. Only latitude, longitude, fuel calculations, and the trust that Nimitz had placed in intelligence, timing, and nerve. The carriers were not where Japanese admirals expected them to be. They were not pressed close against Midway like frightened guardians. They waited beyond the obvious defensive line, positioned to strike the Japanese carriers after Nagumo committed his first blow against the atoll. On the flight decks, crews moved like shadows. Plane captains checked tie-downs, inspected tires, wiped oil from cowlings, and looked into cockpits where pilots would soon climb in. The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers sat with folded wings and dark canopies, their bombs waiting beneath them. TBD Devastator torpedo planes, already outdated and dangerously slow, stood ready with long torpedoes slung under their bellies. Grumman F-4F Wildcats waited with guns loaded, squat and tough, the only fighter shield the carriers had. Men spoke quietly because the silence seemed important. A dropped wrench sounded like a gunshot. The smell of aviation gasoline hung over the decks. It mixed with salt spray, hot oil, exhaust residue, and the faint metallic scent of fear that every sailor recognized but few admitted. Below decks, pilots ate breakfast they barely tasted. Coffee shook in cups as the carriers rolled. Some men joked too loudly. Others wrote letters and folded them with care, as though neat paper might impose order on the next hours. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey of Enterprise knew his air group might have to fly hundreds of miles over empty sea, search, strike, and return with fuel tanks near dry. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron of Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 studied his men and understood what their slow devastators would face if Japanese fighters found them. On Midway itself, the morning came with a different tension. Marine pilots and ground crews waited beside aircraft parked on the coral runways. Radar operators searched the sky. Anti-aircraft crews stood near their guns, shirts sticking to their backs in the humid air. The island smelled of dust, fuel, seawater, and crushed coral. Everyone knew the Japanese were close now. The only question was which horizon would tear open first. At 4:30 in the morning, Nagumo began launching his first attack wave. From the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, Japanese aircraft lifted into the gray Pacific dawn. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers climbed into formation, their engines droning above the fleet. They were bound for Midway. Their mission was to smash the island's airfields, fuel tanks, hangars, and defenses before the invasion force arrived. To Nagumo, this was the beginning of a familiar pattern. Strike the enemy base, destroy its air power, and force the remaining American fleet into battle under Japanese control. But the pattern was already broken. Unknown to Nagumo, the American carriers were not waiting near the island. Unknown to him, Nimitz had placed them where they could become the hunters. Unknown to him, the launch of the Midway strike had begun the very sequence that could expose his carriers at their most vulnerable moment. At Midway, radar screens soon showed the incoming formation. The warning went out. Men ran. Engines coughed to life. Aircraft began taking off from the coral runways before Japanese bombs could trap them on the ground. Marine fighters climbed to intercept, their pilots facing veterans who had already fought across the Pacific. Army bombers, Navy patrol planes, and Marine strike aircraft scattered into the morning sky, many with orders to find and attack the Japanese fleet. Then the Japanese arrived. The sky over Midway filled with engine noise. Bombs fell through smoke and sunlight. Hangars erupted. Fuel tanks burned. Coral dust blasted across the runways. Anti-aircraft guns fired until barrels heated and crews shouted through the thunder. Marines watched aircraft come down trailing flame. Japanese pilots roared low over the island, disciplined, fast, and deadly. Yet Midway did not die. The runways were damaged, but not destroyed. Guns still fired. Communications still worked. Aircraft had escaped before the worst of the attack. When the Japanese strike leader assessed the results, he saw that another attack would be necessary. That message would soon reach Nagumo and force him into a choice that Nimitz had anticipated, aboard Akagi. Nagumo received reports that Midway's defenses remained dangerous. His first wave had not finished the job. At the same time, he had reserve aircraft aboard his carriers armed for naval attack. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs ready in case American ships appeared. But no confirmed sighting of American carriers had reached him. If Midway needed another strike, those reserve aircraft would have to be rearmed with land bombs. The order was given. Torpedoes came off. Bombs came up. Hangar crews began the dangerous work of shifting weapons, fueling planes, and preparing another attack on the island. It was skilled work, but it filled the hangar decks with explosives, fuel lines, and urgency. The Japanese carriers, normally models of precision, began to enter a state of dangerous transition, and far to the northeast, American scout planes were searching. Nimitz's gamble now depended on eyes in the sky. Engines that did not fail, radio messages that reached the right ships, and commanders willing to launch before every detail was certain. The trap had been placed. Nagumo had stepped toward it, but the ocean still guarded its secrets. And without contact, the American carriers were only armed shadows waiting in the wrong patch of sea. Then, through the morning static, reports began to arrive. Enemy carriers had been sighted. June 4th, 1942. Aboard USS Enterprise. The first reports came like sparks in a dark room. Enemy ships, bearing southwest, distance uncertain, carriers likely. The words moved from radio rooms to plotting tables, from plotting tables to flag bridges, and from flag bridges to men who had been waiting for this exact moment with their stomachs tight and their hands already damp inside their gloves. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance did not have the luxury of perfect information. No commander at sea ever did. But on this morning, Uncertainty felt almost physical. The Japanese fleet was somewhere beyond the horizon, moving, turning, launching, recovering, and changing its own plans. Every minute that passed could carry Nagumo closer to discovering the American carriers. Every minute could allow Japanese scouts to find Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown first. If that happened, the trap Nimitz had designed might close on the wrong side. Spruance understood what Nimitz had trusted him to do. Strike first. Strike before the Japanese could organize their own blow. Strike while Nagumo's decks were crowded and confused by the Midway attack. The intelligence had brought them to Point Luck. But intelligence could not fly the planes, could not guide them through empty sky, and could not promise they would arrive together. On Enterprise, the flight deck came alive. Sailors pulled chocks from wheels. Plane handlers moved with urgent precision, crouching under wings and ducking beneath spinning propellers. Engines coughed, then caught, then roared. Blue exhaust smoke rolled across the deck and blew aft in thick sheets. The carrier turned into the wind, her bow cutting white water as she built speed for launch. The deck trembled under the combined force of engines and sea. Pilots climbed into cockpits and settled into cramped seats. Gunners checked belts of ammunition. Radio men leaned forward, listening for instructions. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers waited with bombs beneath their center lines. The TBD Devastators sat lower and heavier, carrying torpedoes that demanded a slow, straight, dangerous approach against ships protected by fighters and anti-aircraft guns. There was courage on that deck, but there was no illusion. The men knew that Japanese Zero fighters were faster, more agile, and flown by veterans. They knew Japanese anti-aircraft fire could tear the sky apart. They knew torpedo planes had to fly low and steady, almost inviting destruction. Yet the order had come, and the carriers were turning into the wind. Spruance launched. Enterprise sent her aircraft into the morning one by one. Each plane rolled forward, tail lifting, wheels bouncing over the deck, then dropped briefly beyond the bow before climbing away over the Pacific. Hornet launched as well, her air group rising into the brightening sky. The formations circled, gathered, and began the long flight toward the estimated Japanese position. But war rarely honors neat formations. The American squadrons spread out. Some climbed, some flew lower. Navigation errors crept in. Radio discipline, distance, and confusion separated groups that were supposed to strike together. Hornet's air group would suffer a disastrous misdirection, with many aircraft flying toward empty ocean. Enterprise's squadrons pressed on, but even they faced the terrible problem of finding moving ships across a featureless sea. Aboard Hornet, Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron of Torpedo. Squadron 8 became convinced that the assigned course was wrong. Waldron was stubborn, experienced, and unwilling to lead his men into nothingness while the enemy carriers escaped. His squadron of TBD Devastators broke away, flying the course he believed would find the Japanese. The men of Torpedo 8 flew low over the water. Their aircraft were slow, aging, and vulnerable. The sea below them flashed in the morning light. Inside the cockpits, pilots watched fuel gauges, compasses, and the horizon. Some men gripped controls so tightly their hands ached. Others stared into the distance, searching for the first shape of ships. Then they saw them. Nagumo's force lay ahead. For the Japanese, the morning had become a storm of conflicting reports. American aircraft from Midway had already attacked in scattered waves. High-level bombers had missed. Torpedo planes from the island had come in bravely and been cut down. Japanese fighters had been pulled low, chasing attackers close to the water. At the same time, Nagumo had received a scout report that changed everything American ships had been sighted. The report was incomplete at first. It did not immediately identify carriers, but the possibility was enough to freeze the decision-making aboard Akagi. Aircraft below decks were being rearmed for a second strike on Midway. Torpedoes and bombs were being shifted. Fueling was underway. Returning aircraft from the first Midway strike needed to land. Combat air patrol fighters needed fuel and ammunition. The clean sequence of Japanese carrier operations had become a knot. Then came Waldron. Torpedo 8 approached without fighter cover. The devastators descended toward the sea and formed for attack. Japanese lookouts spotted them. Alarms rang. Zero fighters turned toward the low incoming aircraft. Anti-aircraft guns trained out across the water. The attack became a slaughter. The devastators flew straight because torpedoes demanded it. Their pilots could not twist and climb without ruining their attack runs. Japanese fighters dove on them from above and behind. Tracers ripped through wings and fuselages. Engines burst into flame. Planes struck the sea and vanished in white eruptions. Others limped forward, riddled and burning. Still trying to reach launch distance, Waldron led his men in. One after another, they fell. The water around the Japanese carriers filled with splashes, smoke, and fragments. The torpedoes that were dropped failed to score hits. The squadron was almost entirely destroyed. Ensign George Gay, thrown into the sea, would become one of the few survivors, watching from the water as the battle moved above him. To the Japanese officers watching from their bridges, it may have seemed like another victory. The Americans had come bravely and died. Their torpedoes had missed. Their planes had been swept away. But the real effect was unfolding invisibly. The Japanese combat air patrol had been dragged down toward the waves. Zeros circled low, chasing torpedo planes. Their formations were scattered. Their ammunition was being spent. Their attention was fixed outward and downward. More American torpedo squadrons were approaching in separate attacks, each one suffering terribly, each one adding to the chaos. Aboard the Japanese carriers, crews still worked among fueled and armed aircraft. Bombs, torpedoes, and fuel hoses remained hazards in the hangars. Nagumo still needed to recover aircraft. He still needed to prepare a strike against the American carriers now believed to be nearby. His decks were not ready. His fighters were not where they needed to be. Above the clouds and higher in the morning sky, American dive bombers were still searching. June 4th, 1942. High above the Pacific, southwest of Midway, the dive bombers had nearly missed the battle. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led the Enterprise Air Group across a sky that seemed empty in every direction. Below him, the Pacific stretched blue and indifferent, broken only by sunlight, cloud shadows, and the long white scars of wind on water. Fuel needles crept downward. Every mile carried his SBD Dauntless bombers farther from Enterprise and closer to the point where returning might become impossible. Inside the cockpits, pilots leaned forward, scanning through windshields streaked with salt haze. Rear gunners twisted in their seats, watching the sky behind them for Japanese fighters. The air was cold at altitude, but sweat still gathered beneath leather helmets and goggles. The men had launched into uncertainty. Now uncertainty had become a threat as deadly as any enemy gun. McCluskey knew the Japanese carriers should have been there. But the sea below showed nothing. A lesser commander might have turned back. Fuel was life. In carrier aviation, courage did not matter if tanks ran dry before a pilot found his deck again. Yet McCluskey also understood the terrible value of the moment. If he returned without attacking, Nagumo might recover, rearm, and launch a strike that could smash the American carriers. Nimitz's decision to place those carriers in ambush had created a chance, but the chance would disappear unless someone found the target. Then McCluskey saw a ship. It was not a carrier. It was the Japanese destroyer Arashi, racing northward after attacking the American submarine Nautilus. The destroyer's wake cut across the water like a white arrow. McCluskey studied its course. A destroyer moving at high speed was usually not wandering alone. It was hurrying back to something. He turned his bombers and followed the wake. In that instant, The battle narrowed to a line of foam on the ocean. The Dauntlesses pressed onward. Engines droned, fuel burned. Men searched ahead with aching eyes. Then shapes appeared on the horizon. First smoke, then wakes, then the unmistakable forms of warships. Finally, the flat decks. Japanese carriers. Below, Nagumo's force was caught in the worst possible state. The morning's torpedo attacks had failed to hit, but they had pulled the combat air patrol low and scattered it across the sky. Zeros were still down near the water, chasing the last torpedo planes, climbing slowly or returning low on ammunition and fuel, on the carrier decks and in the hangars. Japanese crews were struggling through the complicated process of preparing aircraft for a strike against the American carriers, aboard Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The pressure had become suffocating. Returning aircraft from the Midway strike had to be recovered. Fighters had to be refueled and relaunched. Strike aircraft had to be armed correctly. Bombs and torpedoes moved through hangar spaces. Fuel lines were connected. Aircraft stood close together in packed rows. The ships were not helpless, but they were exposed in a way no carrier commander ever wanted to be exposed. At the same time, another group arrived. Yorktown's dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, were coming in from a different direction. They had faced their own confusion, including accidental losses of some bombs when electrical arming switches were mishandled. Yet they still came. Their arrival almost alongside the Enterprise bombers created the kind of timing that planners dream of and combat almost never provides. The sky above the Japanese carriers suddenly belonged to the Americans. For a heartbeat, the SBD pilots saw everything. Sunlight flashed on wakes. Ships turned hard below, trying to build speed and evade. Anti-aircraft guns swung upward. Tracers began to climb. Smoke curled from stacks. The Japanese carriers that had seemed untouchable across 6 months of war now lay beneath American dive bomb sites. The Dauntlesses rolled over, one after another. They tipped into steep dives. The world became noise, speed, and vibration. Pilots pressed forward against straps as the ocean rushed upward. Dive brakes opened on the wings, rattling the aircraft and holding the descent under control. Wind screamed past canopies. Rear gunners faced backward, helpless for the moment, while pilots fixed their eyes on decks growing larger by the second. Kaga came under attack from Enterprise bombers. She turned desperately, but a carrier could not dodge like a fighter. Bombs fell in sequence. Explosions burst across her flight deck. One bomb struck near aircraft packed for launch. Another tore into the hangar area. Fire leapt outward, fed by fuel, ammunition, and armed planes. Men vanished in flame and splintered steel. Kaga, one of the proud ships of Pearl Harbor, began to burn uncontrollably. Soryu was struck by Yorktown's bombers. Bombs smashed through her deck and detonated among aircraft and weapons. The explosions ripped open her hangars. Fire spread with terrifying speed. Sailors fought hoses, smoke, and heat. But the ship had become a furnace. In minutes, Soryu was no longer a striking weapon. She was a burning wreck. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was hit by a single bomb that proved catastrophic. It struck at a moment when aircraft, fuel, and ordnance made the carrier terribly vulnerable. Flames spread through spaces where crews could not contain them. Smoke rolled upward. Command control faltered. The flagship of the Kido Butai, the symbol of Japan's carrier power, was crippled by one precise blow at the worst possible time. From the water, Ensign George Gay watched smoke climb from the Japanese carriers he had attacked so desperately minutes earlier. He could not hear every order or see every deck clearly, but he knew something impossible had happened. The ships that had destroyed his squadron were burning. Above the fleet, American pilots pulled out of their dives under heavy fire. Some aircraft climbed away damaged. Some did not climb at all. The surviving dauntlesses scattered and turned eastward, searching for the route home. Behind them, 3 Japanese carriers burned under towering black columns of smoke. For Japanese admirals, the shock was almost beyond belief. Only minutes earlier, Nagumo still possessed the core of the most feared carrier force in the world. His ships had been maneuvering, recovering, rearming, and preparing to strike. Now Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were crippled. The carefully trained air groups, the elite deck crews, the machinery of Japan's offensive power in the Pacific had been smashed in a single devastating sequence. Nimitz's decision had reached its moment of truth. The carriers placed in ambush had not merely defended Midway, they had struck the Japanese fleet at the instant its attention. Fighters and decks were divided. The choice that had seemed so dangerous in Pearl Harbor now revealed its purpose in flame. But the battle was not over. One Japanese carrier still moved free. Hiryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, had escaped the first disaster. Her decks were intact. Her aircraft were still capable of striking, and while Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned, Hiryu turned into the wind to launch revenge. June 4th, 1942. Aboard the Japanese carrier Hiryu, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi knew what the black columns on the horizon meant. Akagi burned. Kaga burned. Soryu burned. The pride of the Kido Butai had been struck down in minutes, not after a long gunnery duel, not under the slow pounding of battleships, but by dive bombers that had arrived from empty sky at the exact moment Japan's carriers were tangled in their own operations. The shock moved through Hiryu like an electrical current. Men stared across the water at smoke rising from sister ships that had seemed invincible only that morning. Yamaguchi did not freeze. He was aggressive, disciplined, and painfully aware that the battle still had one sharp edge left. Hiryu remained operational. Her flight deck was clear enough to launch. Her aircraft were armed. Her pilots were veteran naval aviators who understood that their fleet's survival now depended on immediate action. If American carriers had struck them, then American carriers were somewhere within range. On Hiryu's deck, crews ran through heat, fumes, and alarm bells. Aircraft engines started. Mechanics leaned into prop wash. Ordnance men checked weapons. Pilots climbed into cockpits while smoke from the crippled carriers darkened the horizon behind them. There was no time for ceremony. There was only revenge, duty, and the need to hit before the Americans disappeared. The first Hiryu strike lifted off and flew toward the reported position of the American carrier force. Its target became USS Yorktown. Yorktown had already lived through one disaster at Coral Sea. Her repair crews had worked miracles at Pearl Harbor, patching damage that should have kept her out of the fight. Now she steamed in the open Pacific, launching and recovering aircraft as part of Nimitz's ambush. Her sailors knew that the burning Japanese carriers did not mean safety. A carrier battle was not finished until every flight deck on one side was dead. Lookouts spotted the incoming Japanese planes. General quarters rang through Yorktown. Men raced to stations. Anti-aircraft crews swung guns skyward. Fire control teams tracked approaching specks. Wildcats climbed to intercept, clawing for altitude as the Japanese dive bombers came in. The sky filled again with the sound of engines, gunfire, and shouted reports. The Japanese attack pressed through. Some aircraft were shot down. Others kept coming. Dive bombers rolled into attack, sunlight flashing on wings before they dropped into steep descents. Bombs fell toward Yorktown's flight deck. The carrier turned hard, throwing white water from her bow. Gunners fired until smoke and heat wrapped around them. Then explosions struck. Bombs hit Yorktown and tore into her flight deck and island area. Fires broke out. Smoke rolled across the ship. Men were killed at their stations. Others dragged hoses through wreckage and burning debris. The ship slowed. To Japanese pilots pulling away, Yorktown looked crippled, perhaps doomed, but Yorktown's crew refused to let her die. Damage control parties moved with extraordinary speed. Fires were attacked. Holes were patched. Debris was cleared from the flight deck. Engineers fought to restore power and speed. Medical teams carried wounded men through passageways that smelled of smoke, blood, and hot metal. Officers pushed repairs not because they believed the ship was safe, but because a carrier that could still launch aircraft could still influence the battle. Within a short time, Yorktown was moving again. Her flight deck was made usable. To Japanese scouts who later saw her, she looked so functional that they mistook her for a second, undamaged American carrier. That mistake shaped the next blow. Hiryu launched another strike, this time with torpedo planes. The Japanese believed they were attacking a different carrier. In reality, they were returning to Yorktown, the same scarred ship that had already absorbed bombs and come back to life. The torpedo planes came in low. On Yorktown, men saw them approaching just above the water, where the horizon shimmered and the sea seemed to hide them until the last moments. Anti-aircraft guns hammered downward. Wildcats dove through the attack paths. Japanese pilots held steady because torpedoes demanded a straight run. It was the same kind of courage American torpedo squadrons had shown earlier in the day. But now, Yorktown was the target. Torpedoes entered the water. White wakes streaked toward the carriers. Yorktown turned, but she could not escape them all. Hits slammed into her side. The ship shuddered violently. Men were thrown from their feet. Compartments flooded. Machinery failed. The carrier lost speed and began to list. This time the damage reached deeper. The crew fought again, but the wounds were severe. Yorktown's power faded. Her movement slowed, then stopped. Orders passed to abandon ship when the danger of capsizing and further attack became too great. Men climbed down nets and ropes into destroyers and rafts, looking back at a carrier that had been patched, bombed, revived, and torpedoed in the span of a single battle. She floated wounded, stubborn, and silent, her role in the day already written into history. Hiryu had drawn blood. For a moment, Japanese hope lived again. 3 carriers were burning, but 1 American carrier had been crippled. If Hiryu could strike again, perhaps the balance might shift. Perhaps the remaining American carriers could still be found and destroyed. Perhaps the catastrophe could be contained. But American scouts were searching for Hiryu now, aboard Enterprise and Hornet. The news of Yorktown's damage did not create paralysis. It sharpened urgency. Spruance understood that the last Japanese carrier had to be destroyed before it could launch another attack. The same principle that had guided Nimitz's ambush still ruled the day. Carriers were most dangerous when left alive, and most vulnerable when found. In the afternoon, American aircraft launched again. The pilots were tired. Some had already flown long missions, attacked, survived anti-aircraft fire, and returned low on fuel. Deck crews worked without pause, refueling planes, loading bombs, patching damage, and sending aircraft back into the sky. The smell of gasoline and exhaust never left the flight decks. Men moved like their bodies belonged to the ship, not to themselves. The searchers found Hiryu. She was still fast, still maneuvering, still defended, still dangerous. But she was now alone in a way no Japanese carrier had expected to be alone that morning. The protective strength of the Kido Butai had collapsed. Her sisters burned behind her. Her fighters could not cover every angle. Her deck, like every carrier deck in battle, was a thin wooden and steel skin over fuel, bombs, aircraft, and men. American dive bombers came in. Once again, the dauntless pilots rolled over into steep dives. Hiryu turned hard beneath them. Anti-aircraft fire climbed in frantic bursts. Japanese sailors looked upward and saw dark shapes falling out of the sun. Bombs dropped. Explosions smashed across Hiryu's flight deck. Fire erupted among aircraft and equipment. Smoke surged upward. The carrier that had struck back at Yorktown now became the fourth Japanese flight deck to be crippled that day. Her crew fought with determination, but the damage spread through the ship. Flames found fuel. Heat drove men back. The flight deck became useless. As evening approached, the Pacific was marked by burning carriers across miles of ocean. The Japanese force that had expected to lure the Americans into a trap had been trapped itself. Nimitz carriers, hidden beyond Midway rather than chained to it, had struck from an unexpected direction and at the decisive hour. Nagumo's Admirals, trained in precision and confident in offensive power, now faced the ruin of their carrier arm. Yet aboard the surviving Japanese ships, disbelief fought with duty. Reports had to be sent. Wounded had to be rescued. Fires had to be controlled. Commanders had to admit what their eyes could scarcely accept. 4 carriers had been lost or doomed. The Pacific War had turned in a single day. Night of June 4th, 1942. Aboard the Japanese battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto waited far behind the carrier battle line, surrounded by the massive strength of Japan's combined fleet. Around Yamato, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and support ships moved across the dark Pacific like a steel empire. Their guns were enormous. Their armor was thick. Their crews were trained for the decisive surface battle Japan had imagined for decades. But the battle that mattered had already been fought beyond the reach of those guns. The reports came unevenly, each one heavier than the last. Akagi disabled, Kaga burning. Soryu lost, Hiryu damaged beyond recovery. Aircraft gone, veteran pilots missing, deck crews killed. The words did not sound like a battle report. They sounded like the collapse of an entire idea. Yamamoto had planned Midway as a trap. He meant to draw out the remaining American carriers, crush them, seize the island, and force the United States into a weakened position across the Pacific. His operation was vast, layered and ambitious, stretching across thousands of miles. Battleships waited for a finishing blow. Invasion transports moved with troops. Diversionary forces operated in the Aleutians. The Japanese command expected the Americans to react, to defend, to arrive late and under pressure. Instead, Chester W. Nimitz had chosen not to play the role Japan assigned him. That was the shock Japanese admirals struggled to absorb. Nimitz had not hidden his carriers in panic near Pearl Harbor. He had not tied them to Midway's shoreline. He had not waited passively for Nagumo to finish the island and then turn his full strength against the American fleet. He had read the enemy's intention, trusted the code breakers, accepted terrible risk, and placed his carriers northeast of Midway where they could ambush the attackers. The result now burned across the Pacific, on Japanese destroyers near the crippled carriers. Rescue crews pulled survivors from oil-black water. Men who had launched from polished flight decks that morning now clung to wreckage under smoke-dark skies. Faces were burned. Uniforms were torn. Some sailors asked about their ships and received no answer. Others stared at the horizon where flames still marked the places where Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had once moved as the core of Japan's naval power. Aboard Akogi, fires had moved beyond control. Captain Taijiro Aoki and his crew had fought to save her, but the damage had cut too deep. The flagship that had launched aircraft against Pearl Harbor was now a dying hull. Orders came to abandon ship. Men left reluctantly, some bowing toward the carrier before crossing into destroyers. Similar scenes unfolded around the other wrecks. Each ship carried more than steel. Each carried pride, memory, training, and the confidence of an empire that had believed its offensive momentum could not be stopped. For the Japanese High Command, the numbers were devastating. 4 fleet carriers were lost. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed or trapped aboard doomed ships. More painful still was the loss of experienced pilots, mechanics, armorers, flight deck crews, and aviation specialists. Carriers could someday be replaced by shipyards. Skilled carrier air groups could not be recreated quickly. The men who had mastered deck operations under combat conditions were part of a system that had taken years to build and hours to shatter. Across the ocean, the Americans counted their own losses with grief. Yorktown, after surviving bombs and torpedoes, would later be finished by a Japanese submarine. Destroyer Hammond would go down beside her. Torpedo squadrons had paid a terrible price, especially the men of Torpedo 8, who had flown into almost certain death without fighter cover. Midway's defenders had lost aircraft and men in brave attacks that often failed to score hits. Victory did not erase the cost. It only gave meaning to the sacrifice. But the strategic result was unmistakable. Japan had come to Midway expecting to seize the initiative. Instead, it lost it. The Kido Butai, the striking fist of the Japanese Navy, had been broken. The same carrier force that had dominated the first 6 months of the Pacific War was no longer able to dictate every movement, every battle, and every fear. From that point forward, Japan could still fight with skill, courage, and ferocity, but it would increasingly fight to hold what it had taken rather than expand without check. Nimitz's decision now stood at the center of the transformation. He had faced a choice that could have destroyed what remained of the Pacific Fleet. Keeping the carriers near Midway might have seemed safer, more conventional, easier to explain if disaster came. A defensive posture would have placed them under the shadow of the island, ready to respond to invasion or cover the base. But Nimitz understood that against carrier warfare, waiting could be fatal. The side that found and struck first often decided the battle before the other side could fully react. So he chose the ambush. He turned intelligence into position. He turned position into surprise. He turned surprise into a narrow window over Nagumo's decks, where fueled aircraft, exposed ordnance, scattered fighters, and divided attention made the Japanese carriers vulnerable for minutes. Those minutes were enough. Imagine standing on a Japanese bridge that evening, looking across a sea that had changed color with oil, smoke, and fire. In the morning, officers had believed Midway would complete Japan's Pacific Shield. By night, they understood that the Americans had not merely survived, they had outguessed them. The shock was not just that ships had been lost. Ships could be lost in war. The deeper shock was that the enemy they believed weakened and reactive had anticipated their plan, moved into their blind spot, and struck at the exact hinge of the battle. That realization traveled through the Japanese fleet faster than any official signal. It reached commanders who had trusted the superiority of their carrier arm. It reached staff officers who had helped build the operation. It reached sailors who watched the glow of burning ships fade into darkness. It reached Yamamoto himself, who had warned before the war that Japan could awaken a sleeping giant, and who now saw that giant not merely awake, but learning. By June 5th, the Japanese invasion of Midway could no longer continue. Without the carrier air cover needed to protect transports and warships from American aircraft, the operation had become too dangerous. Yamamoto ordered withdrawal. Ships turned west. Survivors were carried away from the battlefield. Behind them lay oil slicks, wreckage, and the dead at Pearl Harbor. The news arrived with disbelief of a different kind. Men who had watched Battleship Row burn 6 months earlier now heard that 4 Japanese carriers had been destroyed. The victory did not bring back the dead from Pearl Harbor or Coral Sea or the torpedo squadrons lost at Midway, but it changed the horizon. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan had been stopped in a way it could not disguise. Chester W. Nimitz did not win at Midway because he had the larger fleet. He did not win because every American attack succeeded. Many failed with heartbreaking losses. He won because he recognized that defense alone would surrender the rhythm of battle to Japan. He placed his carriers where Japanese admirals did not expect them. then trusted his commanders and airmen to seize the moment when it appeared. The decision shocked Japanese admirals because it broke their assumption they expected a shield. Nimitz gave them a dagger.